Hey everyone, this is Glenn Greenwald back with another episode of System Update here on our home on Rumble. And I'm excited about this episode because it's the first in what I intend to be a series of interviews with people who have become very interested in and knowledgeable about a topic that is increasingly debated with a lot of vehemence and a lot of passion on both sides of the debate, which is the question of whether technology, often referred to as Bitcoin or cryptocurrency or blockchain chain technology, is going to be a positive or a negative force for society. And one of the reasons I'm very interested in this topic is because it does seem clear to me that regardless of where you fall on that question, this technology is going to start to play a greater role in our politics, in our culture, and our financial life. And I think it's extremely important to start trying to develop a better understanding of where it's likely to take us. For myself, it's a topic in which I've actually been interested for a fair amount of time now. I've been speaking to all kinds of people on every side of the debate, coming at it from every direction. I have been doing a lot of reading. It is a complex topic, both the technology of it and also the implications of it. And my own position, and it's the reason why I'm interested in doing these interviews, is because I guess I would describe myself at the moment as kind of being crypto curious, for want of a better term. I'm definitely not somebody who is yet at the fanatical stage of advocating for this technology. I wouldn't even yet say that I'm particularly an enthusiast. But what I have noticed is that there's a lot of fanatical hostility to the very idea that this technology, that this movement can be positive, and I think there's a lot of hostility, particularly on the left, for reasons I don't fully understand, although I think I do understand. And I think one of the really interesting aspects of this is that when the idea of Bitcoin was first entered mainstream consciousness, it was presented as and conceived of as this new currency. And it was talked about only as a currency, as this kind of libertarian currency that was going to be a competitor to the dollar, provide privacy in financial transactions. But it has become so much broader than that, with people claiming that it is the key, the kind of panacea to freeing us from centralized control of corporations and governments, that it will enable the internet to once again be free, that it will enable dissident groups and anti-establishment activists to organize without fear of being monitored, or at least it will be a very powerful tool for all those ends, for privacy, for empowerment of social movements on various sides of the anti-establishment realm, as well as providing privacy and in financial transactions and the like. And so, because there's, I think, a lot of hostility on the left, I wanted to begin the series of discussions with a person whose work I've been following for some time now. He calls himself the blockchain socialist, which, as the name suggests, he is someone who believes in the promise of blockchain from a left wing perspective, believes that leftist movement, leftist ideology can be served by crypto and blockchain, although not only, as I understand it, left wing movements, but any kind of dissident or anti establishment ideology. So I don't want to speak too much about his views since he's actually here to speak for himself. That's why I invited him. Um, Ordinarily, I probably wouldn't interview somebody who uses a pseudonym, but I have followed his work both on Twitter, but also he has a website where he posts material occasionally as well, that I highly recommend if this is a topic in which you're interested, and I hope that you are. And I've become sufficiently confident in his expertise in this topic as somebody who's really worth listening to. And there was an irony when I first invited him on, and I said I, would like to have your name to attach to your advocacy, put your face on screen, and then I immediately realized this is somebody who was chosen on purpose to use a pseudonym, and that's part of the whole idea of this technology is to protect privacy and to preserve it and give individuals the right to maintain it. And obviously, that's been a part of my work as well. So I immediately realized that shouldn't be a requirement. I'm not asking him to vouch for facts of which he's a firsthand witness. It's really someone who I think has developed a really interesting perspective, steeped in a great deal of knowledge about this topic. So let me welcome the blockchain socialist. And thank you so much, first of all, for taking the time to talk to me. And let me just begin by asking you a pretty broad question, which is why is it that this cause has become so interesting and so important to you?
Yeah. Well, first off, thanks for having me. Um, yeah, and thanks for the kind words. It's really nice to hear that you've enjoyed the content that I've been making. But yeah, so it's been a long while since I've been working in the cryptocurrency and blockchain space, and so like it first started off to where, to be completely and like totally transparent, I've said this before, but my initial interest in blockchain and cryptocurrency came out of a place where I was in like a pretty let's say somewhat destitute part of my life, to where I didn't have like very much money, and I just sort of like got interested in cryptocurrency, or as like something to like look into, because well, I thought like I was like, maybe I'm pretty smart and I can like figure it out, and maybe make some money off of it. But yeah, so it started from there. But then as I got into it, it sort of became like something where I realized it was something that was like quite profound as a technology, in the sense of being able to facilitate very, very novel ways of organizing from a left wing perspective. So we know like the story about WikiLeaks as one example, where WikiLeaks, at one point, they had released all of these different documents that showed that the United States and then many of its allies were committing several war crimes in the Middle East. And when they released that, unfortunately, like a lot of banks and like PayPal were sort of forced to take away like their access to banks and to their funds of people who had like donated to them. But luckily, I think about like a couple of months before that, they had started accepting Bitcoin, and it was something to where, um, because they had accepted Bitcoin in that like critical moment, they were able to have like a backup or emergency stash of assets that they can pull into, in which they could like fund the continuation of its infrastructure.
Yeah, just so
Um,
just to interject there because I remember that episode vividly and I actually became a kind of important episode for me, but also I think really illustrates one of the reasons I'm so interested in the promise of this technology to remind people after WikiLeaks published the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs in 2010 and the diplomatic cables and became enemy number one for the CIA and the US security state. They were trying hard to criminalize what WikiLeaks had done, and before they could figure out how to do that, they decided instead to squeeze off their financial support, and they used people like Joe Lieberman, who at the time was the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, to basically threaten financial institutions like PayPal, like Mastercard and Visa, like the Bank of America to cut WikiLeaks off, saying, kind of almost like implicitly threatening them that if they continue to facilitate donations to WikiLeaks, they could be charged criminally as aiding and abetting some kind of threat to national security. And I don't think Mastercard and Visa and the Bank of America and PayPal thought WikiLeaks was worth taking that risk over, even if the risk was small. And they did terminate their accounts all at once, these financial institutions on which WikiLeaks was relying for donations. And I remember thinking what a intimidating and frightening power that was for the government to be able, without charging you with a crime, without proving you've done anything wrong, to essentially through coercion and pressure cut off your finances. And one of the ways that WikiLeaks survived was, as you said, they began investing in Bitcoin and accepting Bitcoin, and that was what led to the creation of what is now called the Freedom of the Press Foundation, an organization that I co-founded with Daniel Ellsberg, the famous Pentagon Papers leaker, and Laura Poitras, the documentarian who won the Academy Award for filming Citizen Four about her work with Edward Snowden, and the actor John Cusack and others. And the idea was we kind of said, we're not going to allow this blockade of WikiLeaks. We're going to accept donations for WikiLeaks and then give them the money, kind of become an intermediary. But that showed me, that moment, how dangerous it is that we can have this centralized currency and these financial institutions subject to centralized control where they could just cut you off and bankrupt you without, and put you, destroy you, obviously, without charging you with any crime. And we're seeing that a lot now with with people deemed extremists on the left and the right. They get kicked off PayPal. The Anti Defamation League is compiling lists of people they deem extremist and working with PayPal to kick them out of the financial services world to prevent them from transferring money. So it was that, you talked about your personal situation. Was that episode kind of the impetus for you to become interested in how these technologies can be valuable politically?
So like during that time, it wasn't exactly that episode, but it was something that like I had taken note of at the time. But like what really expanded it, because right in this in this particular situation, I think the use case became clear. If you are going to challenge capitalist institutions, like the first thing that um, the state or corporations, banks are going to do, one of the things in their arsenal of like tools they can use to stop you is to block access to the funds that you may have gathered in, at least like within banks and within um, like if you're using like the US dollar, for example, if you're in America, like that it's like a very profound and like not trivial thing, I think. And like that's one very big and clear use case in my opinion. But for me it was the expanded sort of functionality that came out with blockchains, that came out after Bitcoin, that really like I think more like solidified my like interest in like wanting to go deeper into it, which was like the functionality of smart contracts and this idea of being able to create contracts that were automatically executed based on like particular conditions being met. And so this idea of what are called decentralized autonomous organizations were something that were like was very powerful to me, and I felt was something that the left, at least the radical left, could really like take advantage of as a very new form of organizing and a new form of like applying political pressure that is frankly like not possible without the technology. So it was like that idea of being able to use the same things that sort of like Bitcoin is able to provide in terms of like being separated from the state apparatus, being separated from like the traditional banking system, and then like applying as well sort of like programmability with digital currencies, and not only like when I say digital currencies, I don't mean solely in the sense of like a financial type of value, but it could be. I mean it really in like probably the most abstract sense you can think about. So like when I say a token, sometimes that brings up images of just
So,
like
before we get into kind of this, the mechanics of
sure, yeah.
crypto and Bitcoin, which I absolutely want to do because it's crucial, at least on a summary level, to have an understanding. Let me just stay for a moment on the political question, because one of the things that I find interesting in general is, and it's obviously, if anyone's familiar with my work, is a major theme, which is, for me, I don't believe that power centers, including the US government or international financial institutions, care very much about whether someone is on the left or the right, if they are anti authority, anti establishment, anti institution. And in fact, one of the things that we're seeing now is a lot of the domestic surveillance authorities and other law enforcement authorities that the FBI and the CIA and the NSA are interested in assembling and fortifying are being done in the name of combating domestic extremism. And the intelligence community will say that when they talk about domestic extremism, in their view, the greatest threat to national security or to the stability of the United States is right wing domestic extremism. And then when they issue reports or charts or little booklets explaining their posture, they'll say that, but then they'll throw into the definition of domestic extremist kind of a whole hodgepodge of people who just want to work to undermine the establishment, whether it be anti-abortion activists, pro-gun activists, people who are against the CIA and federal law enforcement, animal rights groups, environmental groups, Antifa. So I guess from my perspective, kind of the civil libertarian perspective, one of the things that interests me in technologies that can free people to organize and communicate and engage in activism without the government being able to crush it is not so much protecting a left wing or right wing ideology, but instead just the right to dissent in general. And I, happen to think that there's a lot more commonality between anti-establishment people on the right and the left than either one of them likes to acknowledge. But leaving that question aside, you obviously do identify as a leftist, as a socialist. But I'm curious that when you talk about the reasons to be excited about this technology, from a perspective of a radical leftist, if somebody identifies instead as kind of just a non-ideological anti-establishment or anti-authority activist, or even as kind of a anti-establishment populist from the right, do you think that the same potential, the same value from this technology is available to them? Or is there something inherent in radical left-wing activism that makes this technology particularly useful?
No, so I think what scares me being as a leftist is the fact that it is potentially useful for any side of the political spectrum that is like, anti-establishment.
Why does
So
that
like
scare you? Well, why does that scare you?
in the sense that like I mean I'm open about it, right? I'm not bipartisan. I'm partisan, and I'm like left wing and socialist, right? So like it would what would like really make me annoyed and like pissed off is like if I see, and I think there are already sort of the seeds of that happening, to be honest, of like the far right using the technology for their own aims. So I think the technology itself is, I don't want to say like completely neutral. There's a certain neutral. There's an openness to it, in the sense that anybody can sort of, if they wanted to, can sort of like grab it, take it, um, mold it in the way that fits their particular politics if they wanted to, if they make the effort to do so. Um, so like basically you can mold it to either be, left or right if you want to. The problem is like the reason why I felt the reason to start my platform was because I really felt that on the left there was like a very very big lack in like a coherent analysis and understanding of what the technology was, and like what the implications of it were, that just like it was a bit deeper than just like what I was normally seeing in most left wing circles. It was just sort of like, put to the side as being like, oh no, that's only a right wing libertarian thing. It's only like the right. We cannot use it because it's all a scam, whatever, whatever. But I felt like it was a very, very superficial, very, very surface level understanding of what they were talking about. But at the same time, I mean, I can understand why they felt hesitant about it. But I think you got to sort of like, have a bit tougher skin and like be willing to go deeper into it.
Well, I want to examine that a little because one of the way and again, this might just reflect the kind of unsophisticated understanding on my part. which I readily cop to, in terms of at least certain aspects of this discussion, if not the majority of them. But one of the ways I've been thinking about it and trying to talk about it is the technology of encryption. So when, when the internet was first, first started to proliferate, the idea was it was going to be this incredibly exciting, never before seen tool of liberation. It was going to emancipate us from centralized corporate and government control. And as we know, that happened for a while. It was kind of like a wild west of anonymity and dissent, and that was what power centers couldn't stand. And so they began trying to commandeer and co-opt the technology and turn it into this, the opposite, this tool of coercion and control. And one of the solutions that people devised that still believed in and wanted to fight for that model of a free internet was encryption. The idea that we could build a technological wall around what we do on the internet to prevent the government from invading our communications. And it did make it more difficult, although the Snowden reporting and subsequent reporting has revealed that they found a way to invade a lot of the seemingly most formidable encryption. But the idea for me there was, if you're on the right or you're on the left, obviously you're going to use these tools for completely different ends, right? Like, if you're by definition. But the one thing that we all have an interest in, anybody who sees himself as outside the political mainstream, whether on the right or the left, is fighting to preserve the ability of this technology to be used for anti-establishment ends, to liberate social movements, and then you kind of fight it out over what the ideology is. And one of the interesting aspects is, over the past few weeks, there's been one person who has been really sounding the alarm about what she regards as the grave dangers of cryptocurrency and blockchain technology, which is Hillary Clinton, the ultimate guardian of establishment power, who has been, I've seen her in interviews where she gets asked about like Russia or whatever, and she says, before my time is up, I just want to say there's one danger lurking that we're not paying enough attention to, and that's cryptocurrency. It can destabilize the dollar and currencies and all of these things, which signifies to me that if you are anti-establishment in whatever way, I'm not saying you should reflexively embrace whatever she's afraid of or dislikes, but it's a pretty good sign that it does have the power to be threatening to things she holds dear, which is establishment power. So, given that, why do you think there is this incredibly closed-minded hostility, at least on some sectors of the left, when there are people out there like you and even other non-leftist advocates of this technology saying that what this can do is enable you to do radical politics in a way that will strengthen you because it will prevent the government from being able to destroy you or crush you or monitor you? Wouldn't that be something instinctively the left would find appealing, as opposed to wanna just reject out of hand?
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. It's hard for me to say exactly why that is. I mean, I can sort of speculate a bit. I think the left sort of has, um, unfortunately, in my opinion, like sort of fallen on sort of largely state-based solutions or state-based policies for wanting to exert power and influence. So I think, at least in particular in the US, because there is such a huge lack of any large, powerful, influential left wing institutions, like in the absence of that, the only thing that like your imagination can really think of in terms of like having some sort of left wing influence, a positive influence, is via the state. um, and I think it's sort of like, in my opinion, a bit of a like a defeatist mentality that, I think there is this impression that you have. If you look at the world, you have the private sector, which are like corporations, and then you have the public sector, which is the state. And sort of these two powers are sort of like going back and forth at each other. And like, it's like a bit of a flawed worldview, I think, and a bit of a very narrow one. I think there is like a sort of third pole we can look at that we can sort of name the autonomous sector, which is just like people choosing to come together as they want to sort of autonomously try to exert power and create influences. And I think that is like the majority of where left wing uh, like influence has sort of come from in the past. If you look at labor unions do not fit under either the public sector or the private sector. It's really like something different. It's like an autonomous group of workers who have decided to come together and exert their influence. So I think in the U.S. in particular, like, and to be honest, I find much more pushback from American left than I do from others. I think because of that, this sort of like just belief that if only the left sort of like finally elected the perfect left-wing government, then we can have all the influence we want, and then that's sort of like the end of politics. But I think you have to have like a bit of a more long-term view and a bit of a you know you have to be willing to like organize as you are within the environment that sort of exists already. um so
It's just I find it very interesting, in that if you believe that your politics are radical, whether on the right or the left or in any other way, by definition, you have to believe that the success of your political movement will pose a threat to institutions of authority and power because you're by definition seeking to radically subvert or overturn the status quo. And therefore, even if your politics, a leftist politics, calls for some kind of ultimate creation of this benevolent socialist state, and then, kind of using various strains of Marxist dogma, the ultimate disappearance of the state. But before you get there, the creation of this state that will kind of rectify the evils of capitalism and distribute material goods equally and the like, you can't use non-radical means like just voting in a democratic process to achieve radical ends, because institutions of power aren't going to just sit by passively and watch you destroy their foundation, right? The nature of them is they're going to fight back. And so if you really think your politics are radical, you would be attracted to tools that would enable you to combat those institutions of authority. And I wonder whether what this actually reflects, because you said you think the hostility is found more in the American left than the left in other places, which I would agree with, that there's almost a sense in which there is no such thing as a plausible, viable, radical left movement in the United States. Like the furthest left you can go in the mainstream are people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio Cortez and kind of squad politics, who are anything but radical, right? Like they believe that their change will best be fostered by not by using secretive technologies that let you evade the law enforcement processes of the government, which they seem to have a lot of respect for, at least on the federal level, but by, like primarying incumbents and ultimately staying within the Democratic Party. So do you think that the reason why there's a lot of hostility on the left toward what is a kind of radical vision for how this technology can empower people is that the reality is their politics aren't particularly radical?
I'm not. It's hard for me to say exactly like whether or not their politics are radical, but I think it is sort of endemic of what is commonly referred to as just like capitalist realism. In the sense that so capitalist realism is this idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And so I think as neoliberalism has sort of like grown in society and grown in influence over people and over our minds, I would argue it's sort of limiting our imagination and creativity to think about new ways for um, like creating political influence. And so like you know, I think people are just we're coming, especially in America, you're coming from a place where there essentially was no left-wing institutions for quite a long time. And then there has been sort of like a very sudden reemergence, especially with the campaign of Bernie Sanders and like the elections of some of these democratic socialists. And so like people are sort of like figuring out what is possible and what is not possible, coming from a place where I don't know, before, I mean, I remember the George Bush years, like it really felt like nothing was possible, and quite a depressing time. So I mean, yeah, I would, if I were, I prefer not to try to like blame it on particular individuals and try to think like it is like a, to help people recognize this is sort of like an active effort by the establishment, by including the state, including like large capitalist corporations, that they are imposing this type of feeling on us that there is no alternative, right? That we cannot like sort of we cannot expect anything better than either what we have or the sort of smallest, most rudimentary like progressive reform. And so I
Right.
think
Yeah, no,
part of that feeds into the
and I
blockchain thing.
guess that I guess I think what you've described is the American left, at least as it's come to be defined in sort of mainstream political circles. I mean, it's notable. I don't think Bernie Sanders or, Rashida Tlaib or Jamal Bowman have ever uttered those phrases, blockchain and cryptocurrency, in their lives. And my guess is if you ask them about it, they would have like an instinctively negative reaction. And I assume part of your project is to try and change that. And I guess I would say that part of mine is as well, not necessarily because I think that um, it's an important vehicle for left wing ideology, although it might be, but because I just think it's an important tool for political empowerment, and the ability to
Indeed.
work for more radical change. Now, and feel free to add to that, but I just
E-
want to kind of
Well,
get into the. Go ahead. Go ahead.
even I would just add as well, just like as an addition, that there the internet, like basically during the vast majority of the growth of the internet, there was no left in American politics. Meanwhile, the internet was being developed primarily within the United States, and so like it was, it was very easy for Silicon Valley, for like very large corporations to begin to privatize large parts of the internet of what started off as like a semi-nationalized project, became like extremely privatized, and sort of has like it's like it shouldn't be surprising that we've come to the point where we are today, where we have like these walled gardens of big tech corporations who like get to dictate so many of the rules and like the way that we even communicate with one another over the internet in like such profound and like very very influential ways, and they are themselves very very easily influenced by like the US government or various states. If they say that like XYZ person either like shouldn't be able to talk or like whatever, and all the while they are sort of like extracting money out of just simply existing over the internet, they're able to create just newer and better advertising products that they sell to their clients. And so this entire system has been created to sort of prioritize our eyes being on screens all the time, and not only being on screens but being on screens for like engagement. So like Twitter especially, I think, is particularly designed to like elicit, Facebook as well, but to elicit like emotional reactions, because like that's what these companies are selling. They're selling like our interactions between one another so they can use that to create new advertising products. And so like I've talked to people who were part of very radical left wing groups in the 80s and 90s, and they were told by their superiors that they shouldn't engage with the internet, that it was like an American bourgeois toy that like only rich people are into, and it's not going to be anything in the future. But like they've ended up being incredibly wrong, and now you know 30, 40 years later, it's been like sort of accepted that the left needs to be on social media. The left needs to be there where they need to meet where people are at and talk to them where they are. So I think there's I'm sort of like wary. I don't want the left to make like the same mistake with this technology.
Yeah. Well, just as an observation, I mean, I think it's so interesting how the left perceives the right and the right perceives the left. So there are all these very vehemently felt divisions and conflicts and battles on the right between all kinds of sectors that oftentimes people on the left are completely unaware of and simply group all those people as being people on the right. So if you talk to the standard liberal or the standard leftist, to them, of course, like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan and Kevin McCarthy are right wing. They're all right wing, like over there with Trump and everybody else. But of course, if you go and talk to Trump supporters, the idea that those people are actually right wing as opposed to globalists or corporatists, they're going to scoff at that. And I was just, kind of realizing that as you were speaking, we're going to post this on Rumble, but also on YouTube, where there's an ideologically diverse range of viewers. And for people who are on the right, the idea that there was no left wing in politics in the 80s and 90s, and that the left is kind of very underrepresented is something that is going to sound bizarre to them because they think that the left is the dominant political faction because that's who runs the New York Times. That's what Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are, and even Joe Biden. I guess they probably recognize that there's a little bit further left than that, like Bernie and AOC, but it's all kind of the left. So before we get into the specifics of like what is blockchain and why and cryptocurrency and why it has this potential, which I do want to kind of have you give the summary of, because even as someone who's heard it so many times, I can't actually recite it myself. It hasn't quite clicked in, so I'm hoping you'll enable maybe finally me to get it, but other people as well. Just talk about that a little bit more when you talk identify yourself as a radical leftist, like to what extent do you see yourself as different than the establishment wing of the Democratic Party, of like the Nancy Pelosi's and the Chuck Schumers and the Kamala Harris's and even like the Elizabeth Warrens?
Yeah. So yeah. So like all the people that you just listed, I would very very agree that I am not on like the same political side of. But when I say leftist, I really mean like an anti-capitalist, and largely I mean a socialist. So by that I mean where, in very simple terms, is that workers own the means of production, and by means of production, it can mean a lot of different things in various different contexts, but that largely that is referring to like private property and the use of private property to like create the goods and services that we use in our economy. So like, um, eh, if we're thinking about, I don't know, let's take Uber for an example. I want to see Uber owned by all of the workers who work at Uber, to have like a democratic say in what happens at Uber and what happens with all the money that Uber makes, instead of just like a few different shareholders who get to, or capitalists who get to decide on what is done with their resources. So really, my idea of socialism is just expanding democracy, not just from the political realm, but into the economic realm. And so creating basically just a democratic economy. Whereas today, we are largely at the behest of people who own a lot of capital, call them capitalists, people who own a lot of money, who own the land, who own the factories, who own the companies, in which we are sort of reliant on for like our basic needs. And so that's sort of like how I would define that.
Yeah, I'm glad you described that. And one of the reasons I asked is because I think there's this interesting internal contradiction in certainly in Republican politics, but even in actual right wing discourse, which is the idea that the Democratic Party is the left, is,
That's something that I really want to dispel if anyone's
I know you do,
listening.
and so do I. And but this is like an age old kind of um political trope, right? It's like that was like drummed into all of our heads by like the Reagan era. and even before that, right, that like the more further left you go in terms of American liberalism, the more kind of communist or socialist people are. They'll call Nancy Pelosi Marxist. Like I guarantee you, a huge number of people on the right think that she's a Marxist, even though if you ask her, to consider even like more incremental reforms to empower labor, she'll stand up as she did in the CNN town hall, which you can find on CNN in the most animated way I've ever seen her. It was like she was injected with like some huge dose of cocaine right before she did it. She popped out of her seat and she said, "Look, young man who was asking her, we are capitalists." And she means it, right? Like she's trading stock and is worth, $250 million with her and her husband. And I find this, interesting contradiction in a lot of right wing discourse where the critique, almost reflexively, they'll say Democrats are Marxist, Democrats are socialist, Democrats are communist, by which they mean like Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, like the most capitalist people on the planet. But at the same time, they recognize that the Democratic Party has become the party of global capital, of the neoliberal order, that they are serving Google and Amazon, and Silicon Valley and Wall Street, and not at all interested in your vision of the left, which is the kind of classic vision that you empower the worker at the expense of the owners of capital. So they do recognize that the Democratic Party is corporatist and serving the interest of capital. And it's almost like this weird reflex that hasn't been expunged from right wing discourse that they are simultaneously Marxists, even though their vision could not be any more at odds with what you just described as your own. So yeah, so let me just move on to let's talk about like the meat of cryptocurrency and blockchain um and Bitcoin and the like. And I mean, not necessarily like a tutorial that would enable someone to go replicate, like a long lecture, but what is it that people need to understand about how this technology work? How do blockchains work enough to understand what the potential is to transform our political and social order? Like what how does it function and why is that functionality important?
So, in order to understand, I think a blockchain is important to understand two different types of very generalized IT infrastructure. You have what we're sort of used to is the client server model of IT infrastructure. We like when we use Twitter, when we use Facebook, when we use any of these big tech companies, the way that we're using it is we're making a request to the databases owned by the big tech companies. So when I click to submit to send a tweet, I'm sending the request to the servers owned by Twitter. The Twitter servers are taking a look at it, and probably they have some automated checking to see if there's at least not something too bad, and then they sort of spit it out into everybody else's like application of Twitter. So like there is Twitter as the middleman in the middle, facilitating all the different interactions that are happening on Twitter. And that position that they have is like very, very fundamental to their business model and very, very fundamental to collecting all of the data on you so that they can sell new advertising products to their clients, which also means that they create a very, very good system of surveillance, which if the NSA sort of like knocks on their door, they will gladly give because they need to abide by like US law in order to be like a normal company in the US and to make money without like too much issue. This is opposed to
And
what.
and before we get to that, so in other
Mhm.
words, it's a centralized model, right? So there's like a single server controlled by a tech company, and because of that, when you send a tweet or when you try and use their platform, that tech company can decide basically like yes or no. You're allowed to disseminate this idea into the world. They can decide once you do that they can remove it. They can decide that you ought to be banned. And not only can they decide, but governments, the American government, any other government, using either the kind of pressure tactics I described earlier that cause Visa, MasterCard, Amazon, PayPal, and the Bank of America to cut WikiLeaks off, that kind of subtle coercion and threat, using that or using just, regulatory or legal power like governments do to ban certain content. Either those tech companies or governments now have the power because everything is centralized on this one server to control the content that can be disseminated onto the internet. Like that's
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like fundamental to what a lot of big tech companies call like the freemium model, in that we can all freely use Facebook, we can freely use Twitter, but we are still paying. We're just paying in like the cost of our data, so our identities, our like what we want to post and share with one another over these platforms.
okay. And so
Um,
the other, so that's that one model that is currently in use on all these social media platforms and every other platform that enables either those companies or the government to control or censor or regulate or monitor what we're doing and how we're doing it. So so
yeah,
what is this other alternative model? Like how does it provide
right.
an alternative?
And right, and so just to also add, like this client server model is like fundamental to the capitalist system to function. You can apply. It's a very similar model to all of capitalism. But on the other side, you have what's called a peer-to-peer
Yeah, but
model.
go ahead. Just elaborate on that a little before you get to the alternative technology. Like, why is that model fundamental to capitalism?
So I think so. The idea of socialism is that, or the critique of capitalism from a socialist perspective, is that actually you have middlemen uh, who do not create any value in the economy, and these are called capitalists. And the way that they get their power as a capitalist is by becoming that middleman and owning the private property of the things in which that you use, either as a worker or, in the case of big tech, the worker and the user. So like you can think of I mean, landlords is one perspective. They own the property of the apartment or the house at which you own, and you sort of like, because of that power dynamic, they're able to ask you for a rent. They're asked to ask for your money. In the case of big tech, they're sort of asking you for your data, and whenever you click the box, I agree to the terms and conditions, which obviously nobody reads. You are like giving up your right to all of the data that you're producing on their platforms, and your data sort of becomes their property, in which they can then sell and create the products, do some analysis on it, and which their workers do, and then they are able to get a bunch of money off of that. So like, I think there is sort of like this um, misunderstanding that socialism is about, like, I don't know, like extreme centralization of everything. But I would very, very strongly push back against that, and that is actually capitalism, which is sort of like the most centralizing force in our lives, in terms of centralizing wealth and centralizing power in a few people and a few corporations, so that they can continue to make profits.
Yeah, which again is why I find it genuinely bizarre that simply because this technology got branded as a libertarian currency, kind of I don't want to say every, but a huge number of left wing brains simply shut off to the possibility that this is actually affording a model that is fully aligned with what their vision of their politics is, or at least is supposed to be. So you have this
Yeah.
centralized technological model that is what allows all this big tech censorship and all this other control. How does blockchain provide that alternative?
So the alternative structure that blockchain uses is called a peer-to-peer model, or uses a peer-to-peer network. So some of your listeners or you may remember like Napster, LimeWire, FrostWire, these type of like peer-to-peer file sharing services, in which people were able to provide movies or musics that you wanted to listen to or watch, and they would provide it for free. They would just like have a server in their home with a few different files at which they provided, and everyone can sort of like freely share with one another all of these different files. And this was, I think, it gave a glimpse, I think, a tiny bit of what socialism or some sort of post-capitalism can kind of look like, where everyone just sort of like freely was able to share with one another the things that they don't necessarily need at that very moment. But so blockchain sort of uses this peer-to-peer infrastructure slightly differently, not just for peer-to-peer file sharing, but for sharing what's called a ledger, or like a an account book of who owes what to what person. Basically, a blockchain is essentially a network of computers in which different users, or like computers on that network, are sharing with one another um, data, value, and identity. So in the case of Bitcoin was sort of like the first example of using a blockchain. In fact, the Bitcoin white paper didn't even use the word blockchain. So it was sort of like Bitcoin came out, and then they realized, oh, what blockchain is using is actually like there is a structure to it in which it can be modified to fit different needs. And so blockchain sort of show that you can use this peer-to-peer network to uphold like a single truth of the ledger. Similarly, in the way that banks sort of check with one another whether or not they like who owes what money to whom. The difference here is that you don't have these large institutions like banks that are keeping track of the ledger, which have like a lot of power over that ledger, and instead it is just sort of like a computer that you are serving at your home potentially. Although now, when it comes to the Bitcoin network today, of course, everybody is quite aware about the about mining, and that you need like a lot more resources, but that's not always the case, and always has to be under a blockchain system. But that's sort of like a more technical discussion. But yeah, so
Okay,
it
so,
uses.
let me just focus on a concrete example, and this is I'll tell you how I've begun to try and conceive of this, as somebody who's not steeped and never will be in the technology, and because it pertains to a debate that provokes a lot of interest and a lot of passion. I think it's a really helpful analogy to use, not just for illuminating the question, but also for generating interest in it, for why people should care. There's obviously a lot of concern about uh, censorship of political speech by big tech, which often comes from the companies themselves, often comes from their executives or workforce, often comes from governments or other media outlets, creating shame around allowing certain content to be platformed. That is a concern, I would say, primarily on the right, though increasingly on the left. There's an awareness that there's actually a lot of left wing voices being censored from by Google off YouTube and Facebook as well, and Twitter as well. So when I think so for me, that's obviously one of the things in which I'm most interested in. So one of my main questions becomes, well, how can crypto and blockchain solve that problem? Because as we discussed, the central server model is so effective for centralizing authority and power because it goes all into one place and there's one decision maker who controls all of the data and all of the content. And that makes the danger and abuse obvious. So, from my understanding, there's the difference as I've been thinking about it is that's kind of a platform model. So you have Twitter as a platform. As you so well described, you send your tweet into this platform. The keepers of that platform, either in the moment or after, decide yes or no whether that content can be published. The kind of antithesis of that, or the alternative, is a protocol where you don't download Twitter as this device that allows you to access a centralized model. You instead download we each download our individual Twitter that we are the kind of sovereign over, and it allows us to communicate with one another. So, in a networked way, much like Napster did. Um, and I find it very interesting, by the way, that using Napster as the model, I think it's worth recalling how apoplectic the music industry and establishment authority in general became over peer-to-peer technology like Napster, like Mega. To this very day, they're continuing to pursue Kim.com because they thought it was going to destroy Hollywood and the music industry. That was a sign of how powerful and threatening this technology can be. Now, maybe in a way that some people think is theft, but I'm just saying it did have clearly in their minds the potential to be threatening. So the protocol says, I have my own individual Twitter on my account, we all still get to see it because it's connecting to yours and to everybody else's, but there is no centralized power that can remove what I keep on my protocol. I'm the only one who can remove it or decide that it remains. Is that like with regard to the question of why does this crypto model solve the problem of centralized censorship and control over the internet? Is that a reasonably accurate way of thinking about it? And if not, w- talk about what is.
It's reasonable in certain respects. I think that when we're talking about blockchain and crypto, we're usually referring to, although not exclusively, we're referring to financial transactions as being non-censorable. So it's like being able to like take advantage of the peer-to-peer network in which like you send out that, hey, I'm sending, 1 Bitcoin to Glenn. That's being sent out to the network. Everyone is going to like take that in. They're going to take that piece of information and they're going to share it with one another. And the system is sort of set up to where it's incentivizing people to accept all of the transactions rather than like sort of nitpicking which ones don't get in and do get in, as opposed to like a banking network where states do have a very large control and banks themselves are capitalist institutions themselves. So like you know imagine you are a I don't know, you want to create a new workers union, and you go to Wells Fargo and ask them for a bank account. I mean, they're going to say no, or they're going to like, they're going to give you a hard time. So I think in particular, I would say the focus is when it comes to transactions. And when I say transactions, I don't necessarily mean that purely in the financial sense. Although it is like at the moment largely financial transactions, you can also think of different types of transactions. But as well, if you wanted to, you could create like social media platforms that utilize certain aspects of blockchain. It's sort of like up in the air whether or not that's a good idea or not. I think people are still trying to like discover whether it is a good idea, because it's sort of like, okay, you can think of like a transaction as also like sending a tweet. Sending a tweet is a transaction to the client or to the server of Twitter. So like, if you're using this peer-to-peer network in which the network itself is incentivized to take all of the different transactions that are occurring on it, then if you are sending a transaction which is a tweet, then like your tweet will not be sort of like erased. It'll be there, and there is no one that can really like stop that from
Because you
happening.
control it.
Right. Well, because like nobody controls, or
Right.
that
Right.
everybody controls it. Like it's a slightly different conception. It sort of like hurts your brain a little bit when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, and that, let me ask you a few of the common critiques that I hear. In fact, I did yesterday. I did a podcast show with my podcasting partner Andre Domis, who most certainly is a leftist by all measures. He identifies as a Marxist or a communist. Um, and he was quite hostile to the idea of crypto, but we actually kind of talked through it, and he kind of, I think, moved some by the end, and sort of said, yeah, I think it's worth at least keeping an open mind over. um One of the points I have heard him make, and I've heard other people make, is that, we're talking about how crypto is this incredibly threatening technology. I raised the fact that Hillary Clinton has gone out of her way to warn about it. The other side of that, though, is you do see a lot of institutions that seem welcoming of this technology. You see banks, I think, now are investing in cryptocurrency. There are corporations like the NBA that have crypto ads on their or in their arenas. There are famous celebrities who are, going and pitching the idea of cryptocurrency. Obviously, that's because there's a lot of money behind it and people see it as a money-making scheme, and so I guess, that is the criticism I wanna ask you is, how threatening is it really to the establishment if large parts of the establishment are apparently embracing it? And, you know, when you think about the aspect of this technology that can be liberatory, as we've been discussing, or empowering or emancipating, is that danger that all this really is like a way for rich people to hide their money and launder their money and keep it out of the monitoring realm of governments and away from tax authorities? Is that a serious concern, or is that just kind of like an ancillary risk?
Well, I mean, I would. It's a very good question. It's a very like valid concern. So I think it's very much a double-edged sword in the same way that the internet is a very double-edged sword. We, on the left, we can, organize workers via a digital platform to, to organize a strike or something like that. But as well, you can have like far right wing, I don't know, paramilitaries also use the internet to organize their own types of meetings and what they want to do. So I mean, I try to use that type of framework when thinking about this. I don't think that so like I definitely have a very high concern about like the amount of venture capital that's going into
Yeah.
the
Hmm.
blockchain space,
Hmm.
and it is very like concerning and yeah, don't like. I think it goes against a lot of people. So people have like mixed thoughts on it. I think there's a lot of people who are even I'm talking about like apolitical people who are like quite concerned about the amount of venture capital, and then some of them who are like totally embracing of it. I think it's just like you know a consequence of like people being apolitical, but I don't think that is a sign that we should ignore it. I don't think that's a sign that we should just like toss it to the side, like, oh, it's over. The venture capitalists are here. Let's throw it out in the trash. It's done for. I
Otherwise,
think
as you said, like if they believe that, they would continue to follow that early leftist advice that proved to be so misguided to ignore the internet because what's more overrun by venture capital than the internet?
right, exactly, yeah. So like, I mean, I don't think that just because there's a lot of venture capital, you should throw it away. But instead, that is a signal that it is like it's like a field of political struggle that should be taken absolutely seriously. So I mean, you
But
know,
but like it is so true, and I think this often gets lost. I find this a really fascinating point. Obviously, any technology on some you almost said earlier that it was kind of value neutral or ideologically neutral, and then kind of went
it
back and
depends.
said, yeah, no, and you kind of put some nuance on that, but I mean, any technology, right? The automobile, the plane, the telephone, um, has the potential both to do good and to do bad. I mean, in a lot of ways, technology, it all depends on how it's used. And I often think about this in the context of debates over liberty and freedoms and things like freedom of speech, where when you advocate freedom of speech, obviously people point out the cost and the downsides, which is people get to disseminate extremist ideologies, they get to provoke other people into violence, into things that we regard as undesirable. But obviously, free speech is an incredibly powerful tool for marginalized groups to advocate for changes in society that has been used to foster all kinds of positive change. And, every freedom has cost. So, we in our constitution and in many other countries' constitutions or just legal framework put limits on the ability of the police to barge into our homes. They need judicial approval in the form of a search warrant or some kind of good cause demonstrated. It's not true in every country. Some countries they get to barge in wherever they want. But in general, we put limits in the West and in the democratic world on the ability of the police to barge in our home. There's a huge cost to that, which is that makes it a lot more difficult for the police to catch dangerous criminals. Rapists are on the loose, murderers, pedophiles. It's an impediment to the police. It makes it more difficult for them to do the job that we would want them to do. And so whenever the argument is made that, well, it was like with encryption, the same thing, it will allow pedophiles to use the internet without detection. It will allow terrorists to plot without being monitored, all of which was true. But at the same time, there's this incredible value, which is dissidents can also then communicate without fear of detection. I'm always kind of, I don't know quite how to circumvent this almost instinct that if you can identify a single danger or a single harm to a particular technology or to a particular idea, it means you just write it off without actually engaging in a cost benefit analysis. So even if it does offer the ability of venture capitalists to launder money or to engage in get rich quick schemes or to use some kind of scheme to circumvent tax laws. That might be a harm that needs control, or maybe that's not a harm we can do anything about, and yet you still have to look at the other side of the equation in order to evaluate whether on the whole it's a net benefit or not.
Yeah, it's definitely it's a very complicated question, and there is no like easy answer to it. But I definitely don't think that the answer to it is to limit yourself, is to limit like what you are allowed to use to reach your own goals. Um, and so, like, I think there are very, very clear examples and reasons why you would want to use the technology, and plenty of reasons why you would not. Right? I'm not like telling people that blockchain or crypto is going to create socialism, or it's going to free the working class or whatever. Really, it's I'm trying to have like this very nuanced view and like very uh, view that is like informed by like a political and like social understanding, not like a purely like technological one. Um, so I mean, yeah, I understand the concerns, but I mean, there are so many examples already, the internet being just like the prime clear one at this very moment, of where people can do bad or good things on it depending on what you design it to do and what you choose to do on it. Of course, that is like very influenced by sort of like the structure of the internet as it is today, in which we don't have much say over, because it is like highly privatized. But like like it would today be very, very silly for you to go up to any socialist that is alive today to be like, no, don't go on the internet, like don't use it, it is filled with venture capital. It's sort of like a very self-defeating type of thing. And sometimes I wonder if that's just because the left has been so defeated for such a long time, that it's sort of, we still need to discover like the fire in us to like to win again.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, and if you just look at the internet, if you look at what it's actually done, it has created private corporations that are more powerful than any corporations in all of human history, not just in terms of the wealth that they've amassed, like Apple, but in terms of the data that they control, like Google and Facebook. The technology of artificial intelligence is almost entirely privatized in the hands of those two companies because they've just purchased them from academia and are using them for their own ends. And so, any person, let alone a leftist or anyone who's an anti establishment, should regard the status quo, which has relied on this extremely centralized model, as disturbing. So, almost necessarily a technology designed to disrupt it should be something that at least that is worth examining about how it can be exploited or weaponized. But let me ask you that question, because this again, it reminds me a lot of the encryption debate, that encryption was going to be this panacea. Government surveillance had ruined the internet. um, Corporate control of the internet had degraded its value. Encryption was going to be the thing that was going to save us all, but ultimately the government found a way to invade that. And just even like last week, there was an article about how in the Roger Stone case, documents were released showing that the FBI has the power, when the courts authorize it to do so, to invade what was supposed to be this incredibly sacred end-to-end encryption offered by WhatsApp, that is owned by Facebook. When I look at how Bitcoin and crypto are currently developing, in a lot of ways, I'm starting to see it emerge with a similar system. There's Coinbase, there are these corporate intermediaries, there are brokers. do, I'm having a hard time believing, I guess, that we're not going to just end up in the same place where this technology that's supposed to guarantee anonymity is instead going to almost reinforce the ability of governments to monitor and track us, and for centralized authority to commandeer the system to further strengthen themselves. Are you optimistic about that?
Well, so I would say two things. One, I would say that blockchain and cryptocurrency, the I think it is a bit of a misunderstanding that it is like meant for anonymity. Actually, I think it's sort of it's a complicated question, but I think a complicated answer. But you it's difficult to achieve full anonymity. I would say it's more like pseudo anonymity on a blockchain system, and that sort of like misunderstanding can be hurtful if you don't know. But there are ways around it, and which is like a very complicated technical discussion. But the second thing I would say is that the reason, the very big reason why, at least in my opinion, why big tech grew was because there was no contingency against capital. In the sense that, like I mentioned in the beginning, there was no big left wing institution to exert any sort of influence and power when it came to the evolution of the internet. Whereas today, I mean, if you're looking at the cryptocurrency space, of course, you're seeing basically a continuation of the same thing because there is still no like big left wing institution that can exert influence or power over the digital space. So like to me, I don't think that it is a endemic to the technology itself, as if that is the only possible um, future that can be created is one that looks very similar to big tech. I think it is more endemic of the current situation we find ourselves in living under capitalism, that it is a reflection of capitalism. All of the spectacular things that you see in the news about speculation about the price going up and down and going wild. Um, like the media loves to highlight the movement of price because it is like a very very fundamental thing to capitalism, and like it is very very it causes a lot of emotions under the type of capitalism we live under in today, when like these price fluctuations happen. It's like largely a spectacle. It is like something that they sort of like avert your eyes to, like this thing that this crazy thing that's happening.
Yeah, it
And
discredits it. It kinda makes it seem like it's a joke, like it has no anchor. It doesn't operate like
mhm.
the markets that we've been taught to trust and place our faith in, which again, raises the irony that the left has kind of been, I think, dissuaded using kind of an anti-left framework as to why this technology should be scoffed at rather than taken seriously. Um I think for me, um, I think one of the things that I know is gonna happen, I one of the things that I know is gonna happen is that as this technology does become more potent and widespread and used and more resources are poured into its development, not for the kind of sketchy financial gain, but for the broader political and cultural transformation you've been describing, it is going to produce a backlash among power centers. They're going to start to try and regulate it. They're going to start to try and uh, prohibit it or prescribe it legally. There was that movement in the 90s. People have forgotten when, in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, the Clinton administration used that to demand a backdoor to encryption, basically to prevent encryption from existing in any real form. So those kind of things are going to happen. And what I'm sort of interested in the first instance is not attaching an ideological label to this technology, because it's so important that citizens of all kinds band together in the first instance to prevent any sort of attempt legally or in other ways to render this technology useless or legally barred, that there has to be a movement in defense of it. And like I said, once it's kind of developed and protected and preserved, people can then fight over the uses to which it's put. Um, do you, is that, and that's one of the reasons why I want to put, a leftist advocate of blockchain on, and then the next kind of like a right wing advocate of blockchain on, because I don't actually, I see why it is that from an ideological perspective, as somebody who's interested in in ideology, you're looking at how can I exploit this technology to advance my political aims. That's exactly how you should be thinking of it. But are you open to the idea that in the first instance, that the only way to prevent this technology from being crushed before it can even really be cultivated is by people banding together across ideological lines in defense of the right to use it?
To a certain extent, yes, in the sense that, like, I mean, I'm more of the opinion that any sort of successful political movement is going to have somewhat awkward alliances. And of course, there are. I'm not saying that you should go align with the most like right wing radical fascists just because they have like one opinion of the same. Whatever. I mean, I think it's a complicated thing, and we don't get to we don't live in the environment of our choosing. So like, I'm sorry that we have to live with contradictions, is what I think. We can only be so lucky to live without contradictions. Contradiction is just like a fundamental part of living, and interacting with people. It's sort of an unavoidable part of life. And so like I think what would be, if I were to imagine my best case scenario, it would be that yes, there would be a type of like multi-political, not entirely completely coherent and standardized political movement around like thinking about this technology. But at the very least, the left would have a strong enough like presence and influence to where people can like point to them and say like, oh, those are the guys on the left. They're the ones that are standing up for this technology for whatever reason, because they believe in XYZ, which I also believe in. And and I, being someone who maybe like is I don't know, ambivalently not left or right, or ambivalently like just trying to be apolitical, but then like through the process of, I think, talking to each other, and like through the process of getting to know each other a little bit better, and seeing that we have like a lot of different principles and beliefs that actually align much more than you previously believed, then you would consider being like a part of the left, or you would consider like being allies of the left. So like I think you know it's a complicated, and it's always context specific whether or not you should go in alliance with XYZ person because they have like this specific belief in agreements with you. But I think that's always going to be the case for any type of like successful political movement, that you have to be okay with the contradictions, and you just have to be able to maneuver within those contradictions and like take advantage of them for your own political goals.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a overarching theme of mine and belief that I'm picturing somebody firmly on the right having listened to you for the last hour and 15 minutes or so, and trying to see through their eyes how they would evaluate what the pitch you've made. And I actually believe that, other than when you're using identifiable leftist jargon, that they kind of reflexively recoil when they hear that the vast majority of what you've said is, if not completely in alignment with their own way of looking at things like the danger of big tech centralization and our enslavement to corporate power and the like, is at least something that they wouldn't be hostile to, which is why I say, like, oftentimes I think that these labels do create greater divisions than actually exist. And sometimes these quote unquote alliances or coalitions that might be uncomfortable or contain contradictions, they might end up bringing you to a place where you actually rethink you discover that the differences you think you have with the people you've decided are in this completely opposite camp that you're just in a de facto alliance with, or an issue by issue alliance with, are in fact people who are in agreement a lot more than you think with your worldview, but just don't accept the labels. And ultimately, I think that if I were very devoted to a particular ideology, if I define my politics by fervent devotion to a particular political cause, the thing that would scare me the most is if a new technology emerged that clearly had the potential to be very powerful, and I looked around and saw everybody in my political camp saying, Oh, I want nothing to do with that technology. I don't wanna have anything to any involvement in that instrument. I don't even wanna understand what that weapon is. I'm just gonna mock it and insist that every like-minded person ignore it and scorn it, therefore leaving the playing field to all the people who are my ideological opponents. That would be really scary to me, and as you said, that's something that was a sentiment on the left, and I think you're doing an outstanding job in trying to combat that, if for no other reason than because as a leftist, that probably is scary to you. Watching this like reflexive, pervasive fear of this technology that you see as powerful. So let me, I would love to continue the discussion. I've found it very engrossing as I found your work. I hope that all of you, however you identify ideologically, um, will follow him on Twitter, where is where I found him, and he can be found at TB Socialist, and we'll put the graphic on screen to make it easier for people to find you. You also have a website, theblockchainsocialist.com, as well as a couple of other platforms that you're using, all of which are in your Twitter bio. I think it's evident from those of you who listen that he's a very kind of nuanced, thoughtful, non-dogmatic thinker about these issues. And look, blockchain and crypto is something that we're going to have to deal with in our future. And if, like me, you had been avoiding it for a while because the technology and terminology seemed daunting, you don't necessarily have to master every last aspect of it in order to start to grapple with the political and social implications. So, I want to thank you so much for the excellent discussion that I found really illuminating. Thanks for your great work, which I will continue to follow, and I hope others will as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Glenn. It was amazing to be able to talk to you about this.
Yeah, we'll definitely do it again. Thank you.